Good morning, welcome to Insiders. As every week goes by, it feels more like an election campaign. And as every week goes by, it's a fresh policy debate that dominates politics. Yes, policies. That's what the public constantly demands, and right now, that's what they're getting in spades. During this week, and no doubt during many more to come, it was climate change.
Prime Minister, why won't the government join Labor in committing to cut Australia's greenhouse pollution by 60% by 2050?
I'm not going to join the Labor Party in destroying the jobs of Australian coal miners. I'm not going to join the Australian Labor Party in committing to targets which will do disproportionate damage to the Australian economy.
And taxation was in the mix as well, as it will be all the way through until the budget in May and beyond. The Treasurer, Peter Costello, insisted a Rudd Labor government would increase the rate of the GST and then demanded of the states that they do more to cut their taxes.
As I said to the states, it's not a hard thing to do. Nobody's going to complain if you do it. It'll be well received and it'll be good for the economy. And I recommended to them that they try tax cuts, try abolition of taxes.
He's got the biggest windfall, $24 billion. $24 billion in 06, 07. What have the states got? They got about $2 or $3 billion. Tax reform's a very good objective, and we should always be trying to make our tax system better. But if you want to achieve tax reform, you don't go out there with a megaphone behaving like a lout.
The Treasurer, Peter Costello, is our guest on Insiders this morning. And a question for the panel when they join us. Has Kevin Rudd got a glass jaw? All that coming up. But first, for the latest news overnight, it's Good Morning, Katrina Blouse.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. Swimming great Ian Thorpe will hold a press conference today in response to allegations he's being investigated over a positive drug test. Meantime, the Australian Sports Anti-Drug Agency has defended the time it's taken to reveal the test results, which it received last May. Arrangements are underway to transfer convicted terrorism supporter David Hicks back to Australia. But a union has raised concerns that the decision to have such a special needs prisoner serve his 9-month sentence in a South Australian jail will place extra stress on the prison system. A senior Iranian diplomat says legal proceedings have begun against the 15 British naval personnel being detained by Iran. The group was arrested 9 days ago amidst claims it was in Iranian waters. And some of Sydney's greatest icons were plunged into darkness last night to help cut the city's greenhouse gas emissions. Homes and businesses joined more famous landmarks in turning off their lights for an hour. And Barry, I'll have more news at 11 o'clock.
Katrina, thank you. Well, federal parliament's up now until the budget in May. After all these years in office, that might feel a bit like Groundhog Day for Peter Costello. But as always, this budget will be critical in the political cycle, not the least because it will act as an early economic test for the new Labor leader, Kevin Rudd. So what lies in store? Does the Treasurer have a $20 billion plus tax receipt windfall as a starting point? The State Treasurers are saying that. The Treasurer is our program guest this morning. Good morning and welcome.
Good to be with you, Barry.
Well, that's what the State Treasurers are saying, $24 billion, so bring on the tax cuts.
Well, Barry, bear this in mind that last year we cut tax by $37 billion over 4 years, and we also announced that there would be another tax cut cutting in on the 1st of July this year. That is, we're going to abolish all taxes for tax funds, all taxes on pensions and lump sums that come out of superannuation. So that was announced last year, due to take effect. If you're over 60, your money will come out of superannuation tax-free.
And the economy is still strong, so I would presume the capacity is still there to do something similar?
No, the tax cuts that we announced, the income tax cuts in addition to superannuation, of course, $36 billion to take effect over 4 years, and that was a very, very large tax cut in last year's budget. You know, we moved thresholds, we cut rates, we increased the low-income tax offset. But the principle that I follow, and I think it's a good principle, is if you can so grow the economy that you can fund your services, balance your budget, pay off Labor debt, and reduce taxes, you should try and do that. We've done that the last couple of years.
And that's a fair description of the economy at the moment, isn't it? You
well,
can do all that.
Well, actually, the economy at the moment has been buffeted by the worst drought in 100 years. That's one of the things that's holding us back. We know we're now going into big challenges with the ageing of the population, and of course you have to balance all of these matters up
Your option's limited as well because, one, you don't want to feed inflation, and secondly, you want to save some money for the election campaign.
It's not that so much. What happens in these situations is you've got to look out at the economic prospects. We have big expenditures. For example, we have troops in the field in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Solomon Islands, in East Timor. We have a very large build-up in defence equipment. You would have seen announcements for new Hornets, and we're making some big decisions there. So you've got to take into account your spending, and of course, you're quite right, you don't want to do anything that would overcook the economy. So, you know, this is a judgment call. The Australian economy is $1 trillion. A federal budget is over $200 billion. You know, a 1% margin for error is $2 billion. These are very fine judgments. It takes a lot of experience and a lot of work to put it together.
And you say you don't want to overcook the economy. If interest rates were to go up on Wednesday, that would be another signal to you, wouldn't it, that to be careful?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on movement of interest rates, except to say this, that you have to keep inflation low. One of the successes of this government has been keeping inflation between 2 and 3%. Under our predecessors, it was up around 8%. So to keep that inflation rate low requires, again, very, very careful management. Now, we've got a few tests, haven't we? You would have noticed the petrol price has gone up.
Because it's Easter?
Well, it's gone up even before Easter. That's the bad news, again, because of world movements. So, again, there's not a margin for error. You're targeting between a huge drought, inflationary forces, a big defence build-up. You've got pressures coming from the ageing of the population and health. And into all of this mix, you've got to make fine judgments, and it takes a lot of experience.
And I read this morning there's also pressures coming from within the Liberal Party to drop the top marginal rate from 45 to 40. Are you discussing that internally?
Well, look, I read that in the paper this morning too. That was news to me.
So you can rule that one out?
Well, Barry, from now until budget night, journalists will fall over themselves to have a shock horror exclusive. You and I know that. And all I can do is what I will do. I'll say, wait for budget night.
When you met with the State Treasurers on Friday, what did you put up as a priority, as they described it, a financial boost to businesses who are buying off office blocks rather than tax relief for first home buyers?
Well, Barry, because that's the tax they agreed to abolish.
I think they said they agreed to consider that one.
This doesn't come from nowhere, Barry. Look, everybody in Australia knows when the GST was introduced, when the revenue was given to the states, it was in return for the abolition of other taxes. Everybody in Australia knows that. And we outlined the other taxes. Now, in fairness, some of the taxes have been abolished. But in unfairness, some of them haven't. And the people of Australia want someone standing in their corner saying, hey, this is all part of a deal. The GST is supposed to replace other taxes. Now, you've got 8 Labor states and territories all saying, oh, we'll take the GST. Yes, thank you. We'd like some more of that. But the second leg of the argument, the abolition of all the other taxes, oh, no, can't do that.
I think that the people with the person standing in their corner going into bat for them would be saying, give the money as tax relief for first home buyers, not for businesses buying office blocks.
Well, you see, Barry, that's in fact what I did. Because when they said, well, it's just this particular tax we're against abolishing, I said, all right, if that's your objection, let's take the money, the $2.4 billion that the abolition of this tax would save people.
So you called their bluff.
And why don't you offer to take $2.4 billion off conveyancing charges for first homes? And at that point, there was a deathly silence. You see, the point wasn't that they were in favour of abolishing this tax rather than that tax. The point was that they wanted to keep the GST, but not fulfil the second leg. Now, the important political point is this, Barry. In that room, you had 8 Labor states, all wanting more GST and more tax. You had one person standing in the corner of the Australian taxpayer. Now, After the next federal election, that one person could be Labor. You could have 9 Labor governments in that room.
But you set yourself up as the
let me
person
finish this point.
Well,
and you'd have a weak and inexperienced leader in the form of Kevin Rudd with long-term serving powerful Labor premiers. And I'll tell you this, he wouldn't have the wherewithal to stand up to the political onslaught.
That really does sound like trying to kick a goal from full-back, really, trying to persuade the country that Kevin Rudd would increase the rate of the GST.
A goal from full-back?
Yes.
I'd put that a goal inside the 10-metre square, Barry, that one. Who do you think's got the power in the Labor Party? Some of these premiers have been around 10 years. Who do you think's got the money in the Labor Party? All of these state Labor branches cashed up.
But Kevin Rudd says over his dead body. Now, that's a fairly categoric denial, and you know that would be political suicide for him to increase the rate of the GST first term in office.
The point I actually made is he wouldn't have the power to stand up to Labor premiers who refuse to abolish the taxes that have already been agreed for abolition. That's the point I made. You jumped on a point. Now, let me ask you this. Did Kevin Rudd on Friday demand that the state premiers abolish those taxes? You just saw his shadow treasurer, who comes out with, these are little sort of focus group tested attacks on me. But did he actually demand that the states abolish these taxes? You had a long grad from him. Did you hear any pressure on the states? No, I tell you never will, Barry. And the reason you won't is because basically Rudd and Swan will be beholden to much more powerful premiers, and there won't be anybody in the room standing up for the Australian taxpayer. Do
you accept, though, that one day into the future, perhaps after you're long gone, but the economy won't be strong forever, and that at some stage you will need to raise more revenue, and then it'll simply be a choice between whether you tax income or whether you tax consumption, and so inevitably, at some stage, governments are going to have a look at this issue once again?
Oh, I think that's the argument Mr Rudd will put, that one day we'll have to raise tax.
Isn't it true? Isn't it inevitable?
And you'll find that day will come a lot quicker. No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so.
The economy can't grow forever.
No. I believe that having put the 10% GST in place and it rising revenues for states year after year, after having put our other tax reforms in place, including the cutting of company tax and income tax, that the tax system is well placed to produce the revenue needed for significant services. Now, when I release the intergenerational report, I will show that in 40 years' time, there are going to be significant strains. But there are things we can do now to prepare for 40 years' time.
But won't that report, though, as I understand it, show that the situation is improving, and it has improved since the last report?
What the report will show is that a couple of the measures we've taken have really improved the outlook for 40 years' time. The reducing net debt, getting rid of the Labor debt. That was the first big point. They got rid of $96 billion. The second it shows is that the Future Fund, if the Future Fund stays in place, will also make a big reduction in future expenses. So it'll show that we're making progress, but it won't show we're out of the woods.
But will it also show, though, that more older men are staying in the workforce, birth rates are up, and therefore there is less pressure?
Well, birth rates are up, and it's a welcome thing. I mean, nobody's worked harder to improve birth rates than me, not personally, but politically. But they're only up from 1.7 to 1.8, so we don't want to overstate it, and you have to get it to 2.1 to have replacement. But there is an area where we seem to be having success, and that is the days of early retirement, of taking your superannuation at 55 and then retiring for the rest of your life. They seem to be coming to an end. There does seem to be, and again, the government's been delivering this message over and over and over again, does seem to be an increase in men staying in the workforce beyond 55.
But if all that's improving, then doesn't that also suggest that you'll meet your liabilities, your public service superannuation liability sooner, and in fact you might be able to go to the Future Fund and use some of the excess money for productive purposes?
These are all positive signs, but it's positive signs against a backdrop of a gap of 5% of GDP. That is an enormous gap, 5% of GDP. So we're making positive signs, but gee, we've got a long way to go.
But when Helen Coonan said, though, if that was the case, hypothetically, then you might be able to go to the Future Fund at some stage. once you've met your liabilities?
Once you go to the future fund's dead. Well, once a politician decides he can open up the superannuation savings of other people and use them for election purposes, it's dead. Let me tell you this, Barry. Kevin Rudd's raid on the future funds, just the first one, he says, oh, this is only a $2.7 billion raid. But every politician in Australia thinks to themselves, if you can get $2.7 billion out today to buy votes, $4 billion tomorrow.
It's a thin edge of the wedge argument, though. It doesn't always hold
But
up.
no, it does, because let me tell you, there is no other private sector employer that raids the company's superannuation fund. There has never been a state government, with the exception of Brian Burke, that has proposed to raid a state superannuation fund. If a federal government can raid a federal superannuation fund, it's open for all purposes.
On climate change, do you accept that corporate Australia is overdue for a signal from the government about a carbon policy?
The government has set up a working party which has had a look at a emissions trading scheme with business. It has published a report that is being discussed. And I think that business and the government's working quite cooperatively.
But they're probably looking for a steer now, and that might explain why the climate summit that Kevin Rudd called in Canberra yesterday was so well represented.
Well, I think the thing that a lot of business would want to know, and certainly the government would want to know, is what the shape of the international water is going to be, because it'd be a funny thing if Australia made all of its electricity less competitive, but in the big users around the world, like China and India, there was no incentive whatsoever to either clean up coal or to engage in carbon emission reduction. You know, that wouldn't make any difference to the world. Or, you know, it would be a funny thing if Australia made all of its electricity more expensive and yet carbon emissions continued to grow and grow and grow, and the problem got worse. And so I think what we're looking for is what the international position will be, and that's why we're working on this initiative with China and India under APCs.
And perhaps Kevin Rudd's on the right track then to take a delegation to China, because they're absolutely critical to this.
Look, Kevin goes to China very regularly. I know that for a fact, because every time I'm in China, they say, "Oh, we've just had a delegation here from Mr. Rudd." So,
well, it's a good thing, isn't it?
It's not a bad thing to go to China, but you know, I wouldn't say this is anything novel or new. I wouldn't say he's doing something that the Prime Minister hasn't done, or a whole host of Australian leaders. So, I mean, he's going to China. That's good. No, I'm not critical of that, but he's not Marco Polo, you know. He's not the first man to have gone to China.
Do you think he has a glass jaw, Kevin Rudd?
I think Kevin is engaging in extreme media control. I think he has a little group of people who are trying to package him as a product and keep him from scrutiny, and I think it's paying off. But after a while, people will say, well, you know, who actually is running this show? Hawker Britain and the public relations consultants and the media minders, or the bloke who's putting himself up for election. That's the risk he runs. He would say to himself, well, this media control has been very successful. Look where I am in the polls. But, you know, the public wants somebody real who can get out there and answer questions, not somebody who's packaged by media minders.
Just a couple of quick questions. David Hicks will be out, it appears, on New Year's Eve. Does that seem just a little light to you in terms of the sentence?
David Hicks admits that he trained with a couple of terrorist organisations, including Al-Qaeda, which killed thousands of people, including Australians. Let's make this point. David Hicks trained with an organisation which has killed Australians.
And he will be out of jail by New Year's Eve.
Fought against coalition forces, including Australians, in Afghanistan. Now, when you take into account that he's done 5 years, effectively, he might be out in 9 months. That means that he'll have served around 6 years. That's a pretty stiff sentence. But I must say, for those people who say, poor David Hicks, I say the poor dead and their families that died in the World Trade Centre and in the Bali bombings.
Well, Given the danger, the nature that you portrayed the guy and the government and others, you portrayed him as a very dangerous man, and yet he'll be free to roam the country next year.
Yeah, well, he trained with an organisation that killed Australians, and he fought with an organisation that fought against Australians, and he fought against his own country. And there's been a lot of coverage recently on David Hicks. Why don't we just remember some of the families of some of the victims? I saw one of them in the paper today. They're dead, and they were killed either through the organisation or the complicity of an organisation that David Hicks trained with.
One final question, and it's one that everybody in Australia has a view on right now. Ian Thorpe, are you surprised that he's now under a cloud?
I am surprised. I think he's been a fabulous athlete and a fabulous man and a great champion. And everybody's entitled to the fruits of a wonderful career, which he is, and I hope that this can be worked out. I know he's going to make a statement in relation to it, but there are a lot of Australians admire what he did.
Thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks, Barry.
I think there's been a completely inarticulate domestic policy on climate change from the federal government, so I don't really see how we can actually say that they're spending enough on climate change at all.
I don't think the federal government can be rushed into these decisions. Years ago we thought we were heading to an ice age, and now we think the planet's melting.
I think the federal government don't know how to gauge how much money to put towards the climate change. They've got a lot of other issues, and I think really at the grassroots, the Australian public has to look at the way we deal with things, turn lights off, water down the drain. There's a whole issue, and if we're going to be a world leader, we've got to set that example.
In and of itself, spending $200 million to slow deforestation in Southeast Asia is not a bad idea, but if this is the government's response to a policy on climate change, well then it's completely inadequate.
We've got to start somewhere, but there's probably going to be a lot more money required than $200 million.
Why are we spending that in Asia?
I think you've got to educate your children as well. I mean, it's a conversation that's got to start from the grassroots, and it's no good us trying to implement change in someone else's country or whatever.
Too much money is going overseas. Far too much.
Well, we've got to look at here. This is the problem. I think everyone at the moment in Australia is actually surfing that great wave. Everyone's employed. We all want 2 cars, 2 videos, and all the trappings that go with success. Australians aren't going to want to change, and that's a big issue that we've got to get over.
Short of giving every member of the Labor Party a lobotomy, it would be quite hard for them to do worse than the Howard government. The Howard government has completely denied climate change as an issue.
To have a total Labor government throughout Australia, I think, would be the ruination. We'd be broke within a couple of years. Well, it's time we started voting for what the policies that these particular people are putting up.
Exactly, and that's why everyone should be articulating very strong and very firm policies about climate change.
I think you're right.
Oh, it'll be a fun mob to go fishing with. You get lots of points of view, I think, with them. Karen, the point, though, that one of them raised was if you've got $200 million to spend it here, not in Asia. Now, that's, you keep hearing that.
Well, it's an interesting point. Like, I think even the Greens have said in principle they've got no problem with trying to reduce deforestation overseas, but I think the government is very deliberately trying to avoid doing anything here because Tasmania is the heartland of all of these issues, and it's volatile in terms of forestry and greenies. And, you know, look at the last election campaign. Who wants to undermine the image of John Howard, who on the government side, with all those loggers around him cheering him because of his forest policy?
No, but it's not just that, Karen. I mean, we just don't have a deforestation problem in Australia. We have got forest policies maintained, lots and lots of old-growth forests, and not being wood chipped to buggery.
Well, I think there are people who would disagree with you there.
Yeah, of course there are. There are a lot of people that don't tell the truth. But in fact, most of the deforestation is occurring in places like Indonesia, and I think that is a legitimate area of concern.
Well, Barry, I reckon it was high marks, Glenn, for the deforestation initiative, though. If it works, that's the question. I mean, is $200 million enough money to kickstart something as big as this?
Well, no. but it's a start. And I think, you know, that was a good focus group in a tinny there. I mean, the fact is the bloke that says, well, you've got to start somewhere. And the dilemma here about the whole global warming debate is, do you start at home or do you focus overseas? If it's a global problem, how do you get the mix right? And, you know, I think they're all legitimate questions they raise, but it's a start.
I mean, the sign, I saw, when I was in Asia, reporting from Asia, I saw the sign of the deforestation there. That incomparable to what we have here.
Oh, it's
when they
dreadful.
had the
It is
smoke
dreadful. It's
clouds,
true.
I was sitting in Kuala Lumpur, you needed your headlights on to see the street in daytime because of all the burning in Indonesia.
Yeah, but
You know,
Andrew,
people
isn't this the
thinking
point,
it
though?
should be spent here instead.
But one less tree is a problem. You know, I mean, you've got to start somewhere. Well,
not really.
well, it is.
Not really. You knock down a very old tree that's about to rot, and you plant a new one. You actually contribute to.
But it's clear the government is trying
solving global warming.
It needs to do something on global warming, and it is choosing
Does
to
it?
do.
Does it?
Well, there's another debate. It's choosing to do something abroad, and it's the same attitude with the Kyoto Protocol, refusing to sign up to that because developing countries weren't doing anything. It's choosing to do things on a broader stage than at home, because at home there is a domestic political.
How about starting with Papua New Guinea? And I think they've probably lost a little bit of influence in Papua New Guinea over the past year or so.
But isn't the debate here that this is a drop
really?
in the bucket?
Yeah.
But, you know, if everybody puts a drop in the bucket, then the bucket gets full. Yeah.
But you know what I like about it? Look, forget all the symbolic, sign a little treat or something. This is something that's real in a sense. It's income transfer to a poor country to have nice forests, and I don't really care. It probably has no effect on global warming like anything else we will try, but at least it do some good.
And no one's criticised that. That's exactly right.
All right, we'll get some background and analysis now on many elements of the climate change story this week from Paul Kelly, political commentator with The Australian. Paul, good morning. I guess it was Sir Nicholas Stern's visit to Australia that kicked off this debate midweek.
It certainly was, Barry. I think one of the features of Stern's trip to Australia was the extent to which it really dramatised and highlighted the differences between John Howard and Kevin Rudd on climate change. Stern is a most articulate spokesman for the European view that action on climate change is needed now on the basis of long-term targets, that is the 60% cut in emissions by 2050, and that's also the Labor Party position. So Rudd and Stern were speaking from the same page. John Howard in Parliament, in fact on the same day that he saw Sir Nicholas, repudiated this target. He said it would do great damage to the Australian economy. He signalled that he won't have a bar of the target, that he intends to campaign against the Labor Party on the basis that Labor's position will do too much damage to the energy sector, too much damage to jobs and to the coal industry overall.
Yeah, just on that question of the Prime Minister claiming to do great damage to the economy, Kevin Rudd yesterday said, well, no, it's not the environment versus the economy. He says the two are linked.
If you don't act on climate change, you are sacrificing jobs and the economy long term, and even in the shorter term as well.
So clearly there he's responding directly to that statement from the Prime Minister.
He is, Barry, and this was very much the theme of the Climate Change Summit, which Kevin Rudd called yesterday. Rudd does see climate change in economic terms. He's very focused on the opportunities involved in it in terms of new investment and new technologies for Australia. The whole purpose of the summit yesterday was to bring the business community with the Labor Party, and I think one of the really interesting features of this debate at the moment is the movement inside the business sector. Rudd is determined above all that he will set the pace on climate change, and one of the things he announced yesterday was that the Labor Party will inaugurate its own Stern review. This will be a joint initiative of federal Labor and the Labor state governments. This will be a major review. It'll be completed after the federal election later this year, and the purpose is to look at the economic and employment consequences for Australia of action on climate change, and Rudd in particular stressed the need to highlight the employment and economic consequences of doing nothing. Labor certainly believes that it's in Australia's economic interest to take action now.
Andrew Boulder's shaking his head at the very thought of Australia's own Stern report, so we'll get to that with him shortly. What do you make of the China initiative? And again, Peter Costello was a little dismissive of that.
I think this was a very interesting and perhaps predictable move by Kevin Rudd. He will lead a Labor delegation to China in June, comprising a number of shadow ministers, Wayne Swan, Peter Garrett, Anthony Albanese and others. They'll take with them scientists and also Australian businessmen and people from the energy sector. Their talks with the Chinese will focus on two issues in particular. One will be the post-Kyoto, post-2012 arrangements are internationally for control of emissions, and quite clearly, without a strong role for China in those post-2012 arrangements, they can't go far. And the second thing, of course, will be the bilateral links between Australia and China in terms of clean energy. I think the message from Kevin Rudd here, Barry, overall, is that he's committed both domestically and in foreign policy terms, if he becomes Prime Minister, to a very proactive stance on climate change.
And what do you think the Prime Minister's next move will be?
Well, John Howard will continue to take practical action on this front. We saw this last week with the $200 million initiative on forests. And in the middle of the year, John Howard will announce his own national emissions trading regime. This will be a first for Australia. I think the point to watch for is, will there be a target of emission reductions, and if there is a target, what that target will be. The other interesting signal which John Howard gave this week is in relation to the APEC meeting next September on the eve of the election. Howard wants to ensure that climate change is one of the main issues, if not the main issue, discussed at that APEC meeting.
Paul, thanks for your time this morning. Now, Andrew, what's so wrong with having a review in this country that is far more specific to the problems here?
Look, one is I was astonished that Nicola Sturgeon, in his visit here, was treated as a demigod, unquestioned. Kevin Rudd hails him. In fact, experts around the world, including people who really believe in global warming, he's just one of them. There's 14 experts who put a Stern report, say that he's a fraud. He's treated here as a god. Point one. Point two, no one knows, including Kevin Rudd, how to actually achieve anything like a 60% cut in our emissions in 43 years by 2050. No one. Look at Kevin Rudd's latest proposal. Going to China for talks. A new report, just a report. And a new Office of Climate Change. Talks, reports, offices.
Well, he's
Labor
not actually,
has
he's
no
not, despite
clue
what
how to do
the
it.
impression he tries to give, he's not actually running the country yet.
Are you sure about that?
So there's not much more than that you can do in
No,
opposition, really,
no,
is there?
this is not a proposal. He hasn't got a single proposal to cut the emissions by 60%, which will, don't make no mistake about it, devastate the Australian economy.
You're quite right, that we
none.
need some nuts and bolts. We need to see
And
how
here I
those
am.
targets would
I'm
be.
the bolt, here's the nut.
Yeah, well, I was drawing the two together.
Isn't the real problem here that he's putting the cart before the horse, surely? I mean, he's announced a 60% reduction by 2050, and at his own conference he's admitting he doesn't know what the impact of that will be, and that's why he's commissioning a report to find out. What happens if this Australian Stern report comes down and tells us it's a disaster for the economy? What does he do then?
He'll make sure it won't. The whole thing is so
that's where he would be
stage-managed.
like the government, wouldn't he?
It'll be so staged. Look, honestly, Glenn, there is no way you can cut the emissions conceivably by 60%.
All right, well,
and it's all talk.
Just before you go, that's the Labor's position as you see it, but what about the government now? They've got a few questions to answer as well, because their policies don't seem to be, certainly on putting a price on carbon. Kevin Rudd put this question to the Prime Minister during the week.
I refer to the Prime Minister's statement this morning when he said, "I think a price on carbon is an important element of getting a grip on this thing," meaning climate change. Prime Minister, what do you have in mind in terms of the structure of the market you intend to construct that will set the price for carbon?
For the information of the Leader of the Opposition, governments don't construct markets. Markets are developed by people who buy and sell goods and services.
The markets wouldn't mind a bit of a steer by now, though, wouldn't they?
Well, and I mean, this is the antithesis of the sort of thing that John Howard likes to talk about. He doesn't like the idea of a carbon tax or a carbon pricing system. He's been drawn to this and forced to this by this becoming a political issue. But yes, they need some definition, some structure. This is something where you do need guidance from the government. You can't just stand back and say, let the market do its best, because it's an interventionary move, and he's going to have to deal with it.
Massive intervention. I'm not surprised there are all these business people at Kevin Rudd's climate change seminar, because if you really are seriously proposing these huge cuts, then as a businessman you need to hear from the horse's mouth just what they're going to do to you.
The other point I'd make, Barry, is that if you got around the corridors yesterday, a lot of these experts, and I mean a lot from former chief scientists down, were saying that you had to put nuclear power into the mix. And this is a concept which Kevin Rudd just won't even countenance.
That's beyond question, Glenn, because look, they're talking about, look, we'll throw in $500 million into clean coal technology to research it, and even that's not proven. The truth is, if clean coal technology can even be made to work, even by retrofitting existing power stations as we have now, you will ensure that the price of electricity will be higher, much higher, than it is for nuclear. It'll mean you have to go nuclear to be competitive.
We have this problem on both sides. They've both put restrictions around what they will examine. So when we saw a review of the possibilities of nuclear, it didn't go into great detail about alternatives. It didn't look at solar. It didn't look at other alternatives.
That's not an alternative.
Similarly, yesterday, nuclear was nowhere to be seen on that agenda.
Well, there was somebody else who was nowhere to be seen yesterday on the agenda, and a politician with a very keen interest in climate change. He didn't get an invitation to Kevin Rudd summits. The Greens leader Bob Brown joins us now. Bob Brown, good morning.
Good morning, Barry.
You feel suitably snubbed?
No, not at all. We're in the Parliament with Labor and Liberal, and we've been leading the debate on this climate change problem, which is threatening all Australians, everybody around the planet, for a couple of decades now. And it's good they're engaged, and it's good that it's on the national political agenda, albeit so late after a decade of complete neglect by the Howard government.
Did you hear anything yesterday that you liked?
Well, I think the fact that the the alternative government, Labor, would go for an assessment on the economic ramifications of climate change on this country is very important. It's not just an environmental or lifestyle problem. We are looking at not just the rising price of electricity to help fix it, but rising sea levels around the country, which could see massive economic penalties as well as disruption to societies. All our big cities are on the coasts. We're looking at 95% death of the barrier reef. There's 33,000 jobs and billions of dollars of investment involved there. Massive droughts.
Well, Bob Brown, it's Glenn Milne here. You talk about economic costs. I mean, the argument here surely is one of the difficulties of changing our sort of baseload power system, moving to things like solar, is it will cost too much. I also noticed you in the audience there at Nicholas Stern's address at the National Press Club.
Yes.
You were nodding admiringly, but he says nuclear's got to be in the mix. Is he wrong?
Well, I think he is, but what he also will tell you is that it's only a component. The other thing he mentioned,
but a legitimate component, surely.
Let me just. It's being considered. I don't think it's a safe option in an age where we've just been talking about Al-Qaeda on this program. They're asking the world to give them the technology to use it, and Labor says it wants to expand uranium exports, as the government indeed does, but no nuclear power stations in this country, as if they're going to be in safer hands overseas. And let me tell you what Sir Nicholas Stern also referred to was energy efficiency, and a program there which would be enormous in creating jobs and investment in new technology could free up 30% of current energy used in this country for new uses. Nuclear can't match that, and that is safe, and that's completely carbon neutral. It completely saves the atmosphere, and yet it's off the agenda of both the big parties. This is the best alternative, and it must be put on the front of the agenda because it can be done so rapidly.
Bob Brown, we've only got a couple of minutes, but I wanted to ask you about David Hicks. As you heard from Peter Costello, he painted this picture of a very dangerous man who's about to be walking the streets.
Well, I think there is to be little sympathy for Hicks going to Afghanistan, but what's been dangerous here is the erosion of Australia's legal system, which has been cast aside by this government, as we've seen an illegal process in the United States, which will come back to haunt John Howard and his ministers, backed up by the Australian government to the eternal shame of this country, and which the Howard government's treated as a 51st state of the United States. Hicks should have been given the rights of a citizen until proven guilty. And now we've got this political fix where Hicks is being flown home to Australia after the election's over and can't talk about it until after the election over. This is an arrangement between John Howard, the Bush administration, and the authorities at Guantanamo Bay, and it's pretty unseemly.
Andrew Bolt from the Herald Sun here. This is a guy that is trained for more months than any other Westerner with an organisation that so far had its hand in the killing of more than 100 Australians and thousands of other people, mainly civilians. When he is freed, New Year's Eve, what do you think should be done with him then?
Well, that will be up to the Australian judicial system.
We know that, but what is your opinion?
Well, my opinion is that if he is not, if the Australian government can't bring charges under our criminal code, which is quite extensive about taking up arms overseas, then like any other citizen, he will be free.
Should he be allowed to make money out of his story, Bob Brown?
I'm sorry, I didn't
Should he
hear
be
that.
allowed to make money out of his story?
I don't think, I've never thought that people who have been convicted of a criminal offence in this country should be able to make money out of it. Hicks hasn't, and yet the criminal code there is available. And I noticed Robert Richter, QC, writing in today's Age, saying that in fact there is the possibility of criminal charges being brought against this government for not aiding, for putting an Australian in danger overseas. More importantly than that, for denying the right of a fair trial to an Australian overseas.
Senator, it's Karen Middleton here. What about the issue of talking to the media? Do you think he should be allowed to speak to the media? There's a gag on him for 12 months.
Yes, of course he should. This is a free and open country. In America, under the American Constitution, it would be illegal to put such a gag on a citizen because they have freedom of speech. We should have a Bill of Rights like that here in Australia, and we should have freedom of speech. And it's a political defence mechanism by the Howard government, which is increasingly embarrassed by its failure to uphold Australian law in this matter.
Bob Brown, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Barry.
How would that work in reality, though? How would the government here become part of the process, become part of the plea bargaining process?
I can't see it. I can't see it. But what I find astonishing is that Bob Brown can talk about charging the Australian government, can talk about letting Hicks, more rights for Hicks, defying these orders about not speaking out, but has nothing to say about what we might do to control David Hicks once he's released in just 9 months.
I think there are contradictions here. Now, setting aside the whole issue of retrospective offences, which, is another issue, if this guy helped the Taliban, that is a pretty
Al-Qaeda.
Bad thing. Well, and Al-Qaeda. I have no sympathy for either of them, particularly not lately.
Good to know.
But if he did that, why is he getting such a light sentence? This is a light sentence.
It is.
So you end up wondering whether, in fact, what he did do is not as bad as they had originally said.
Karen, I can't buy that argument for this reason.
But why is there no mechanism to keep him in?
You can't have it both ways, Karen. You can't have it both ways.
That's what they're trying to do.
The defenders of David Hicks say it's unfair that he was in jail for 6 years. Right, and really, he's going to serve a 6-year sentence in effect. But then you can't turn around and say it's a light sentence of 9 months because the total is in fact 6 years.
The problem is that with a plea bargain that has been done, we really haven't tested what he did. I would like to know exactly what he did and how dangerous he is, because if he's dangerous and he is going to be walking free in January, but we haven't had it tested. Why did the United States and the Australian governments agree to a plea bargain?
To support what you're saying, and there is a bit of inconsistency over all of this, let's have a look at what Alexander Downer had to say during the week about the prospect of a lightish sentence.
The Labor Party's position, on the contrary, is that Hicks should be brought back to Australia and tried. And of course the Labor Party knows that there's no basis for trying him in Australia. Basically the Labor Party's proposition is, well, just let him go and he can wander around the shopping centres of Adelaide.
And he will be anyway.
Can I throw one question into the mix here, Barry? As a bush lawyer, it'll be interesting if David Hicks comes back, talks to the media, gives an alternate view about what he says actually happened over there.
Where are we left then?
No, well, perhaps he's left facing perjury charges in the United States.
But that's true, but he has to go to the United States to face them. But the thing is here...
But he can be extradited.
People are all now, or his defenders are all saying it's about what he said at this plea bargain to avoid a sentence, and therefore it's a coerced testimony, you can ignore it. But they are ignoring what he repeatedly, voluntarily, freely said in letters to his father and elsewhere about what he did. And the fact is, it is just beyond any question that he trained with Al-Qaeda, which is responsible for the deaths of more than 100 Australians, including some probably watching right now.
Andrew, the next question then, is that does that explain why Labor has been shy on the issue? There's been no shyness here this morning, but whenever you go to the Labor Party on this issue, let's have a look at the sort of responses we're getting all week.
It's entirely a matter for David Hicks and his lawyers.
Look, Kevin Rudd is making a statement about David Hicks as we speak, and so you should expect to get that statement from Kevin.
I think we need to be very mindful of that process in not making unnecessary comment.
It would be inappropriate for me at the moment to speculate on whether he will actually receive a custodial sentence.
I think Joe's been right to be cautious about this because we're in the middle of a legal process.
See, this is Kevin Rudd's approach on a lot of things. He's a very cautious person, and he constantly says, I haven't been briefed, I haven't been briefed. And I think he's ducking and weaving on this is because there isn't a lot of information available. I mean, at some point,
that's a bit kind, Karen.
At some point, he's going to have to actually make a statement about this.
It was only a couple of weeks ago he was speculating about Labor using its power to free David Hicks once he came here.
Well, maybe he has been briefed.
I think he's suddenly realised with this confession of David Hicks and what we've heard that the media fuss and the Robert Richters and the Bob Browns, they're over there and the vast Australian public is over here.
Well, he certainly doesn't want to be associated with any sympathy for David Hicks.
Well, he didn't mind only a couple of weeks ago, did he?
Yeah, maybe.
Well, his problem now is that David Hicks has admitted his guilt and, you know, he's indefensible now.
And Glenn, more generally, he's being very selective, Kevin Rudd, in the way that he's dealing with the media. I think I read this morning in Matt Price's column two news conferences with the press gallery in 4 months.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear Peter Costello mention the Hawker Britain name there over in the interview, Barry, because Hawker Britain, for those viewers that don't know it, is basically the PR outfit that managed Bob Carr for all those years. And there's a heavy influx of Bob Carr's minders in Kevin Rudd's office now.
Mark Latham too, actually.
Yeah, but it's easier to control, I think, politicians at a state level than it is at a federal, because the stakes are much higher federally. This bloke's running to become Prime Minister, not the Premier of a state. And I think, yes, they are being selective and they are being controlling.
The question I put to Peter Costello, has Kevin Rudd got a glass jaw? And that's been raised because of an Alan Ramsey column at the weekend where he talked about the article that ran in the Sun Herald that went back and looked at the claims he was making about his childhood. According to the article, Lachlan Harris from Kevin Rudd's office phoned Kerry Ann Walsh, the author of the story, and said, if you publish, we will regard it as a deliberate malicious assault. We'll have 100 people ready to roll tomorrow morning to trash you and your paper. Just before I get another reaction from you on that, Glenn, this is how Kevin Rudd responded to that when the question was put to him yesterday.
I don't think, from what I've heard about it, it is well-founded. I think when it comes to the questions that it refers to, I simply have my own version of events as a kid growing up. I stick by that version of events. That's where the story is as far as I'm concerned.
But did you try to stop the story being published personally?
Not at all, not at all.
Not at all, he says. The quote in Alan Ramsey's column was that he said to an editor of the newspaper, it would be a disgrace if this is the splash. That's not the same as trying to stop it. And he made that phone call, by the way, as we read, Glenn, in one of your columns from Piers Ackerman's home.
Well, I think this is the real story. I mean, if the government's alleging that you're supping with the devil by having lunch with Brian or dinner with Brian Burke, what about Piers Ackerman? I mean, what do they think about that?
I think that's
looking for a safe seat.
I think far more interesting, particularly as a Melburnian, is that according to the editor of the Sun Herald, which is a rival publication to my own, Kevin Rudd said he'd rung the Sunday Age and Age and received assurances from them that they would not run this article, which is raising questions about Kevin Rudd's honesty. I think that's rather odd that the Age and Sunday Age gave him a guarantee they would not run an article prepared by their colleagues in Sydney.
Yeah, I don't know why that was.
Well, I think it shows that Kevin Rudd has got some of the media on a string.
Well, and the other thing is, it wouldn't be the first time this kind of intimidation has gone on.
Well, let's keep it in perspective, because he's nothing like Paul Keating.
I was going to say, I remember phone calls from that office that would make your hair curl.
It's a Labor tradition. It's a Labor tradition. You know, I don't know if any one of us can think of an instance where, say, John Howard would do this sort of thing.
Oh yes, oh yes.
No, speaking, bringing up an editor again and again.
Can I tell you, I've been on the end of a blast from John Howard that was much better than Paul Keating.
Yeah, but can I say this, Glenn, I think part of the problem with Kevin Rudd's office at the moment, you can't get a phone call answered, you can't get an email answered. And it makes it difficult. And that's the sort of arrogance that I don't think you see on display in John Howard's office very often.
No, well, John Howard's always, his media strategy has always been to get out there and make the argument, and that's the best thing you can do, and do it unedited. That's why he does so much live radio.
But he does pick and choose where he does it. And Kevin Rudd is doing the same.
I think he runs a broad church. I mean, he turns up on Late
we'd like to get both of them on our news, and we can't get either of them to come on. So, you know.
Well, can I say, bringing new editors and ringing journalists and threatening them with trashing them and getting out 100 pages.
But I think the point here, Andrew, the point really, Andrew, here is that Kevin Rudd's coming back to the field. I mean, what we're learning about Kevin Rudd and what we're learning about his office is that, you know, they're all basically the same. I mean, this is the way politicians and their officers and leaders' offices work. And, well, exactly. I mean, but that's the really important of the story, I think.
It was interesting, I'm not sure it was on the show or just in a column, I said a few weeks ago that the speculation privately would be how about his personal life was important only in the sense of how he would handle it, whether he was brittle or ride it through. At that stage I thought he was riding it through, now it seems...
So we all wait to see what will happen when the blowtorch is really applied.
Yep.
On the panel this morning, Karen Middleton, Glenn Milne and Andrew Bolt. Talking pictures with Mike Bowers in a second, but to take us through, here's something a bit different. The ABC celebrated 75 years for the politicians in Canberra during the week. Senator Steve Fielding was invited along, and to mark the event he decided to chase the chasers. Here's his videotape.
G'day, well here we are at the ABC 75th anniversary, and guess what? Who's here tonight? Chasers. Well, I'm going to try and chase them tonight. Let's see if we can find them. Hold on, excuse me here. Yes, here we are. We've got Craig here. We've just chased him down. Craig, is it true?
Just get out. No, it's unfair. I'm just coming. Can't a guy come to Parliament without being harassed nowadays?
Look, I've got a question.
You come here and you've got senators calling over you. I'm sick of it. I'm really sick of it.
We've definitely got
I'm Michael Bowers and I'm pictorial editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm talking pictures this morning with Bill Leake, who cartoons for The Australian. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Well, David Hicks pleaded guilty and could be home by Christmas, and it was certainly good news for the Prime Minister. And,
My very word.
And the wonderful prize picked up on it like few. He's actually he's chained to Hicks's verdict and he's got out.
Yeah, that's right. He's out too, of course. Yeah.
This is your look at the situation.
Little take, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I thought it probably would make him feel at home, given that the court was comprised of kangaroos. You know? I was tempted to still draw him with, as I have traditionally drawn him, with the bag over his head, the chains all over him, and the orange jumpsuit, but just make the orange jumpsuit a lot bigger. He's been packing on the pounds as...
what are they feeding him there?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure they'll send a bill home when he leaves.
Well, this week saw the first birthday of the work choices legislation, and it was interesting just to see who was celebrating. Joe Hockey celebrated by going to a trucking yard, and looks like the driver here wants to strangle him.
He's saying, "This is what I want to do to you, but your neck's too big." Julia Gillard referred to him this week as that great big bear of a man. It was one of the better exchanges in the Parliament when he stood up and when he stood up in reply, he said, "I'd like to see more of you too, Julia." As usual, David Rowe doesn't disappoint.
He doesn't disappoint. He has this ability to just throw these images up at you, which you just shudder. It's that down the spine shudder.
Isn't it? You want to go for a wash after you've looked at his cartoon.
Happy birthday! We wouldn't change you for the world. And it's a little baby Howard. Oh, it's got my eyebrows.
Yes, it's wonderful, and a slightly soiled nappy.
I'd say that's full.
A little bundle of electoral joy.
John Kadelka, work choices saved my job, and Rudd saying, let's leave the spin to me from now on.
Well, I think he's making a very good point there, because last Saturday, of course, the people of New South Wales got their choice about his job, and they said, you can keep it. Defying all expectations, the bloke remained in his position.
Prue Goward, the Liberal candidate for Goulburn. I just love this photo's done in her, flat in Goulburn. There's a little his and her sort of shower caps here.
Oh, that's what they are they?
David's.
Well, the head like mine, I don't really have any use for shower caps, so it's interesting to see what one actually looks like. That must be David's, and that must be... Oh, no, David's would be the blue one. Yeah. Oh, it's all very domestic, but I love the way that she's she's decided to slip in a quick prayer on the, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, just have a 2 bob each way. I better put in a word to the Lord.
Pay to the patron saint of postal votes. You get a swing towards you. Well, these extraordinary set of pictures in the current edition of Women's Weekly.
Yeah, I rushed out to get my Women's Weekly just, you know, the other day because I thought I've got to see that.
Got to see Julia. Now, she's had the makeup, she's had the hair, she's with the boyfriend, who's a hairdresser too.
I know. She gets her haircuts for free. So do I, but just quietly, yeah.
I hope that's on her pecuniary interest register.
I think it should be.
You know.
Maybe Christopher Pine should investigate that.
It's kind of reminiscent of Bob and Blanche, isn't it?
It's got a touch of the Bob and Blanches, but very glamorous couple, aren't they? The humanising of Julia is going ahead of pace.
Mate, it is going ahead of pace, and the Rudd-Gillard sort of dream team. Well, look, it's always a great pleasure talking to you, Bill. Thanks very much for taking the time.
You too, Michael. Good fun. Cheers.
Well, Barry, I've got the Julia article here from the Women's Weekly. I started reading it. It said, when they walk, they drape their arms casually around each other's waists. When they sit, they lean into each other as if pulled by a magnetic field. When they stand, she leans her head against his broad shoulder. I thought she was talking about Kevin Rudd when I started the piece, but I'm glad it was Tim.
She's done all this in front of the reporters.
That's right.
Well, I think I must say, to her credit, that's the nicest I've seen her hair look. And now that she's got the style, could she just stick to it instead of making it an object of...
Right, let's move on. The comings and goings of politics this week. Carmen Lawrence is going. Peter Andren is going, but hopes to come back via the Senate. Clearly, he's figured that rather than go and chase a new constituency because of the changes to the boundary, he's going to chase real clout in the Senate. You would think he's had a look at the preference deals and he's got a shot at it.
It's unusual. So. It usually goes the other way. The senators are wanting to get themselves up or down into the House of Representatives, but I don't know how it's going to work.
The really interesting thing is he's got to put himself above the line to actually have a chance, so he's going to have to actually form a party. Now,
He needs a good running mate.
Needs a good running mate. Once you form parties, you tend to get members, and that's when you start to get into difficulties.
It's a huge call, and it seems to me overconfidence, but I don't know, he does. It'd be interesting because if he does actually get to the Senate, he'll have far more power there than he will where he is now.
Which is the point that he's making.
And that's the bottom line in all of this. Now, Senator Santoro, another one who's going, and he says, with his integrity intact?
Integrity never goes out of style, and it is integrity which will allow an aspirant to survive the constant examination of political life. For my own position, I'm proud to say that while my compliance may have had some well-documented omissions, my integrity remains intact.
There you go, Andrew.
Well, I think he's in a very small minority of even Liberal Party members in believing that.
And Bob Debus. Bob Debus is now, well, that's one who may be coming to the Federal Parliament via the seat of Macquarie. You would think, as an Attorney-General in any Rudd Labor government?
Well, they've lost Kelvin Thompson now, haven't they? So they'll be looking for an Attorney-General should they win office. So it's highly likely, I would have thought.
Bob Debus being from Sydney, I suppose we better check whether he's written any references for gangsters, hadn't we?
And one other departure, not a politician, but Sarah Murdoch is leaving the Today Show. Now, we should say, who cares? Well, we care because it drew this response from the politicians.
Just finally, guys, Sarah's last day. Any final words?
Oh.
We're going to really miss you, Sarah. I think the idea of, as it were, waking up to Sarah every Friday morning, that's a rather nice thought, I've got to say. I'm disappointed it's not going to be happening.
I love you. I don't know whether Julia feels the same way, though. I was going to say, now Tony said that, I can understand why Sarah is leaving.
A little creepy.
You got that right, Carl.
Yes. Well, I think Tony went straight to confession after that.
Yeah. Now, look, we'll go to final observations and predictions in just a moment, but Pauline Hanson. Pauline Hanson went on Radio National during the week and left her audience slightly gobsmacked with this observation.
If we look at, say, someone we interviewed on Breakfast the other day, we interviewed the rugby league star Hazem El Masri, a leading Australian, a very popular footy player. He's of a different religion, a religion that is very different to perhaps the mainstream Christian religion of this country. There's no problem?
There are Christian Muslims. There's no problems about that.
No, there's not Christian Muslims.
Well, there are in Pauline's world.
Well, she's brought the two poles together. She's a genius.
Please explain.
She probably made, well, obviously, I think she meant Christian
Arabs.
Or Lebanese Christian, who knows?
Whatever.
I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, we're always interpreting. Final observation.
When we get an announcement from the Prime Minister shortly about more troops for Afghanistan, there'll be a new contingent of Special Forces. That will change the nature of the operation there. They're currently doing reconstruction. That contingent will be doing more forward offensive work. The work they're doing now is dangerous. That will be really dangerous work.
The government's decision to bring forward the intergenerational report and hive it off from the budget signals the start of trying to flick the switch to the economic debate, but it also signals they realise they're in trouble.
And that's at the Press Club tomorrow, Andrew.
Well, it's interesting if it turns out that if Labor had been elected to power, say, 2 years ago or even 1 year ago, David Hicks would be walking free probably, whereas now he admits he actually was an Al-Qaeda trainee.
And that's it for this week. Just a reminder, there will be no Insiders next weekend, Easter Sunday, but I will be back with Offsiders this morning at 10:30. Now, coming up next, Alan Kohler and Inside.